When pain had no mercy. Imagine pain that is not anesthetized, not because they don't want to, but because there is nothing else. England, 19th century. Operating rooms without anesthesia, dentists without pity, and bottles that were called medicine, but that could break the mind or kill. Laudanum, alcohol, opiates. They were drunk before they were cut. They were swallowed to survive a few more minutes, and often so as not to remember what was done to them. This is not the history of medicine. This is the history of survival. Because if you got sick in Victorian England, the question was not, will it hurt, but will you be able to stand it at all? Could you have survived pain without anesthesia in the past, which did not ask for consent, when pain was a condition of survival? After the first few sips, the silence in the room never got any easier. It simply changed shape. Sometimes it got thicker. Sometimes it started to press on the ears like a warning. And sometimes it was so calm that it seemed dangerous. Such was the silence of Victorian medicine. In the 19th century, pain was not considered something extraordinary. It was expected. It was included in the process. It was the part of treatment that was not discussed. Just as the cold in winter or hunger in wartime is not discussed. The doctors did not ask if you were ready. They only checked to see if you were still conscious. Imagine London, not the one they show on postcards, and the real one was smoky, humid, crowded with people who lived too close to each other and too far from help. The disease came quietly here, through a tooth, through a cut, through an infection that no one noticed in time. And at that moment when the pain became unbearable, when your body began to betray you, you didn't go to the hospital. You went to the apothecary. The apothecary in Victorian England was an ambiguous figure. He could be your savior, or he could be the beginning of the end. His shop smelled of alcohol, herbs, and something sweet, heavy, almost honey-like. On the shelves stood hundreds of bottles, dark glass, Latin inscriptions, neat labels. And among them, the ones everyone knew. Laudanum, opium tinctures, alcoholic mixtures so strong they burned the throat before they had time to work. They weren't hidden. They weren't ashamed of them. They were advertised. Soothes the nerves, relieves pain, restores sleep. These words sounded safe, almost caring. But the truth was different. These remedies didn't take away the pain. They only pushed the person away from it, sometimes so far that they never returned. For most patients, there was no choice. There was no real anesthesia yet. Ether and chloroform were just beginning to appear. Dangerous, unpredictable, not available to everyone. And pain was available to everyone. If you needed to pull a tooth, you drank. If you needed to cut tissue, you drank even more. If the pain was so severe that the person screamed, they would simply give them another dose. This was not considered cruelty. This was considered practicality. In medical journals of the time, pain was described as an unpleasant but manageable factor. People's screams were described as a normal reaction. Losing consciousness was described as a convenient bonus. Patients were often tied up, not because they were not trusted, but because the human body instinctively fights back when it is being cut. Sometimes the doctor worked quickly, not out of mercy, but because speed meant less chance of the patient breaking free or dying of shock. And here comes the main question of this story. If pain was inevitable, if fear was part of the process, if all you could offer was a bottle of dark liquid. Would you agree? Because for the Victorian, it wasn't a choice between painful and not painful. It was a choice between pain now and death later. Laudanum became a companion in that choice. Mothers drank it to calm their children. Workers sipped it after their shift. Doctors prescribed it as easily as painkillers are prescribed today. No one yet fully understood that along with pain, it took away freedom. And in this world, where pain was a condition of healing, where fear was part of medicine, and where a bottle might be the last hope, not everyone survived. In the following chapters, we will see how exactly these medicines worked, why they were considered a salvation, and at what point they became a threat. Because Victorian England didn't ask whether you were ready for pain. It only checked whether you had the strength to endure it. The bottle that promised relief. The bottle always looked calm. Dark glass, neat label, even letters that gave the contents the appearance of science, not risk. In Victorian England, this is what trust looked like. People believed not in what was inside, but in how it was presented. The apothecary took his time. He moved slowly, confidently, as if he knew something you didn't, and that knowledge seemed reassuring. When the pain became too much, when the tooth throbbed so much that it was impossible to sleep, when the body trembled with exhaustion, the apothecary didn't ask unnecessary questions. He simply reached for the shelf. Laudanum was one of the most popular remedies, a mixture of opium and alcohol, a clear or slightly amber liquid, sweet to the taste, dangerous, not in its sensations, but in its consequences. The first sips brought what people were looking for most: relief. The pain receded. It did not disappear, but rather receded into the shadows. The world became softer, sounds quieter, thoughts slower. For a person who lived in constant physical stress, this seemed like a miracle. That is why everyone drank laudanum. Women drank it after giving birth. Men drank it after working in factories. It was given to children so that they would not cry at night. And no one saw a threat in this. Alcohol, in turn, was even more accessible. It did not need to be explained. It did not need to be advertised. Vodka, gin, brandy, they were drunk before operations, before tooth extractions, before anything that promised pain. A person was given as much as he could swallow, sometimes until he lost consciousness, sometimes until his fear was completely dulled, and sometimes just to stop his hands from shaking. Doctors knew. A drunk patient moves less. He screams less. He interferes less. This was considered an advantage. Nobody talked about dosage. Nobody talked about addiction. These words did not yet have the meaning we attach to them today. If the pain returned, it meant that there was not enough medicine. If the person began to demand more, it was not considered a problem. It was considered a sign that the medicine was working. But somewhere between relief and oblivion, there was another silence, a silence in which a person could no longer do without this bottle, a silence in which the body began to demand what had once been help. Laudanum ceased to be a medicine. It became a condition of a normal day. Without it, pain, anxiety, trembling returned. With it, the illusion of control appeared. And this was the biggest trap. Because Victorian medicine did not yet know that pain could be cured without tying a person to a bottle. And when addiction began to form, no one called it addiction. They called it weak nerves. a sensitive nature, a peculiarity of the organism. But for many, this was the beginning of a path from which there was no return. Because if pain is the enemy and the bottle is the only weapon, then what happens when you can no longer exist without it? In the next chapter, we will see how these medicines began to enter every home, why even those who were not sick consumed them, and how Victorian society unknowingly made opiates a part of everyday life.
When medicine become a habit. At first, it didn't seem dangerous. No one woke up thinking that today would be the day they would become addicted. No one planned to become a slave to the bottle. Everything happened slowly, almost imperceptibly. Laudanum entered life in the same way as tea or cold medicine. Drops in a spoon, drops in water, drops before bed. Sometimes a little more than yesterday, but always with an excuse. The pain did not go away. The night was difficult. My nerves were broken. In Victorian England, there was no such thing as too often. If a drug was sold openly, it meant it was safe. If a doctor recommended it, it meant it was necessary. And doctors recommended laudanum willingly. It calmed coughs. It stopped diarrhea. It relieved pain. It helped you sleep. And most importantly, it worked quickly. This was especially important in a society where people couldn't afford to be sick for long. Workers, servants, mothers with several children. Pain meant lost income. Insomnia meant mistakes. Weakness meant danger. So laudanum became the solution. But with each passing day, its effects changed. What had once calmed you down now only dulled you. What had once helped you sleep now simply delayed your insomnia. The body got used to it. And when the dose stopped working, it wasn't the medicine's fault. It was the person's fault. She was advised to increase the amount. She was advised to drink more often. She was advised not to worry. Because no one had yet seen the danger in it, especially when women became addicted. Victorian society loved silence, and laudanum made women quiet. It relieved hysteria. It calmed nerves. It helped to overcome fatigue, which was not customary to talk about out loud. Young mothers took it after giving birth. Older women took it for joint pain. Girls took it for weakness. And very quickly, the bottle with the dark liquid became part of the house. It stood next to the medicine, next to the dishes, next to the essentials. Nobody hid it. Nobody was ashamed. But the body remembered. When laudanum was gone, the tremors, the sweat, the anxiety returned. The pain became more acute than before, as if the body was taking revenge for the absence of what it was used to. And it was at this moment that many people first felt fear. Not the fear of pain, but the fear of not having medicine. Because now, pain was not the only problem. Another was appearing: emptiness. The world without laudanum seemed harsh, noisy, hostile. The world with it, muted but manageable. And this was the moment when choice disappeared. A person no longer asked if it was worth it. He only asked where to get more. The pharmacists saw this, but they did not stop it. The demand was too great, and society was not yet ready to admit that its medicine was creating a new form of disease. For if almost everyone swallows sedative drops, then who is sick? In the next chapter, we will see how laudanum ceased to be a private affair, how it found its way into children's rooms, and why even infants in Victorian England often started life on opiates. When medicines were in the children's room. In a Victorian home, the night was supposed to be quiet. Silence meant order. Silence meant that everything was under control. And a baby's crying meant a problem that needed to be solved quickly. No one had time for sleepless nights. Mothers were exhausted. Fathers were at work from morning till night. Children were sick, hungry, or simply frightened by the world they were born into. And it was here that laudanum found a new place. It was no longer seen as a powerful medicine. It was seen as a helper. A few drops in water, a few drops in milk, a few drops and the child would fall asleep. No crying, no movement, no resistance. It looked like relief. The advertisements of the time were calm, almost gentle. Calms the baby. Helps the mother relax. Safe for children. No one wrote about opium. No one explained the effects. The words were chosen so as not to scare. And parents believed. Because Victorian England was not a soft place for children. High mortality, disease, cold rooms, malnutrition. If there was something that could make a child calmer, it was perceived as a blessing. But a child's body is not an adult's body. What dulls pain in an adult could stop a baby's breathing. Sometimes the child slept too long. Sometimes it woke up lethargic. Sometimes it didn't wake up at all. But these cases were rarely associated with the drug. Victorian society had a different explanation. Poor health, natural causes, the will of God. Laudanum remained beyond suspicion. It was present in every class of society. In poor neighborhoods, as the only way to survive the night. In wealthy homes, as part of the first aid kit. And the more often it was used, the less dangerous it seemed. Children who grew up in such conditions were introduced to opiates even before they could speak. Their bodies got used to it. Their nervous systems were formed under the influence of substances that dulled pain but changed the sense of reality. No one thought about the future. They only thought about the present, about silence, about sleep, about the possibility of living another day. And this is where history ceases to be just medical. Because when a whole generation grows up considering opiates as part of normal life, the consequences extend far beyond the confines of hospitals. Laudanum began to shape not just addiction. It began to shape behavior. People became accustomed to seeking relief not in the causes, but in the bottle. Not in a change of circumstances, but in another dose. And when the pain became unbearable, no one asked whether it was safe. They only asked whether it was enough. In the next chapter, we will see how society began to notice the first cracks, how doctors faced the consequences of their own decisions, and what happened when the calming drops ceased to soothe, when medicine began to doubt. At first, these were isolated cases. Doctors paid attention not to the cause, but to the strange coincidence of circumstances. Patients who came not for treatment, but for the same remedy, again and again. They did not complain of pain, they complained of restlessness, of trembling, of the feeling that the world had become too sharp without the drops. Some looked healthy, some even strong, but without laudanum they could not function. Doctors began to notice, if the drug was not given, the patient's condition worsened, not because of the disease, because of the lack of medicine. It was an uncomfortable observation, because it meant that a remedy that had been considered a salvation for years could be the source of a new problem. Cautious formulations appeared in medical journals. No loud words, no direct accusations. Overuse,
adverse reactions, dose dependence. These texts were read slowly, and often between the lines. No one wanted to say the word addiction, because if it was true, then the responsibility did not lie with the patients. It lay with the doctors, with the pharmacists, with the system. And the system did not like to admit mistakes. In addition, laudanum was convenient. It did not require complex equipment. It did not require operating rooms. It did not require time. In a world where medicine was just learning to be precise, it seemed like a compromise. Better to dull the pain than to let the patient die of shock. Better to calm than to watch the panic. And so even those who doubted continued to prescribe it. But doubts grew. Patients appeared in hospitals for whom nothing helped anymore but opiates. Their doses increased. The effect diminished. The body demanded more. And each new portion took a person away from normality. Some doctors began to speak about it openly, quietly, carefully. They were not always listened to, because society had become accustomed to a simple solution, to a bottle, to quick relief. And this is where the tension arose, between what works now and what could destroy the future, between the pain that is visible and the harm that not everyone is ready to admit. Victorian medicine stood on the threshold of change, but the door was not yet open, because there was fear ahead. The fear of leaving the patient with nothing, the fear of returning the pain in full, and most importantly, the fear of asking a question to which there was no simple answer. What if we had been saving people all this time at the cost of their freedom? In the next chapter, we will see how this doubt began to break out, how the first critics appeared, and why the path to true anesthesia proved to be no less dangerous than life without it. When hope became a risk. The news spread slowly, not as a sensation, but as a rumor, passed on in whispers. Somewhere in hospitals, somewhere in classrooms, somewhere between the lines of medical journals. They say pain can be turned off, not dulled, not drowned out with alcohol, not drowned out in opiates, namely, turned off. Ether and chloroform entered medicine cautiously. They frightened even those who had been cutting without anesthesia for years. Because now the patient did not scream, did not resist, did not beg to stop. He simply disappeared. To the doctors, it was almost unnatural. The silence that had previously meant shock or death now meant something else. And this other was frightening. No one knew exactly how ether worked. No one could guarantee that the patient would wake up. Doses were determined by eye. Reactions were unpredictable. Some patients fell asleep too deeply. Some did not wake up at all. And each such death became an argument against anesthesia. Pain is better than silence, said the opponents, because pain meant life. A scream meant that the heart was still beating. But for those who had seen operations without anesthesia, this was a strange logic. Doctors found themselves between two fears. On the one hand, the pain they knew well. On the other, a new silence that could be deadly. And patients were afraid too. Waking up and not remembering the pain seemed like a miracle, but not waking up was a nightmare. That is why many refused. They chose familiar suffering over inexplicable unconsciousness. Alcohol and laudanum had not yet disappeared. They remained a backup option. Plan B. They were given with ether. Before ether. After ether. The system could not let go of old habits at once. And here another danger appeared. Combination. opiates, alcohol, and anesthetics together created mixtures that no one knew how to control. Some patients did not wake up not because of the operation, but because their bodies could not withstand such a load. These deaths rarely made the headlines. They were written off as complications, as poor health, as an unfortunate accident. But the doctors remembered, and the fear returned. Because now it was not just about pain. The question was trust. Would you trust a person who offered you sleep with no guarantee of waking? Would you choose pain that would end or silence that might be the last? Victorian medicine was on the edge. The old world had not yet disappeared. The new world was not yet safe. And between them remained a man, tied to a table, with a bottle by his side, with a mask over his face. In the next chapter, we will see how society began to divide into those who believed in the new medicine and those who preferred to endure pain, and why the path to true anesthesia turned out to be a struggle not only with the body, but also with fear. When pain came off as a must. Changes don't come all at once. This was especially evident in Victorian England. New treatments came first where there was more money, more influence, more time for experimentation. The big hospitals in London were using anesthesia more often, cautiously, with fear, with the constant expectation that something would go wrong. But in the poorer areas, nothing changed. There were still the same bottles, the same drops, the same screams behind closed doors. For many people, pain remained a condition of survival because the new medicine was unavailable. Ether was expensive. It required skill. It required space and time. And alcohol and laudanum were simple, understandable, and cheap. So a quiet inequality arose. Some fell asleep before the operation and woke up with bandaged wounds. Others drank, held onto the edges of the table, and prayed that the doctor would be quick. And this difference changed their attitude towards pain. Those who survived the operation without pain no longer wanted to endure. They began to ask questions. They began to demand. And those who were not offered anything simply remained silent, because silence was a part of life. Doctors also changed. New generations were educated with the idea that pain was not necessary. But the older ones did not always agree. For them, pain was proof. Proof that the patient was alive. Proof that the operation was done correctly. And this dispute lasted for years. Between speed and safety. Between habit and progress. Between what worked yesterday and what could save tomorrow. And the patients found themselves in the middle. They listened to different opinions. They read newspaper clippings. They heard rumors of painless sleep. And each time before treatment, the question arose again. Should we trust the new or tolerate the familiar? For those who already lived with opiate addiction, the choice was even more difficult. Laudanum was no longer just a medicine. It had become part of the body, part of the daily rhythm. Even when the pain could be relieved in other ways, the body demanded the old solution. And so even in a world where pain was gradually losing its power, the addiction remained. This was a different kind of pain, quieter, longer, and it couldn't be turned off by the airwaves. In the next chapter, we'll see how Victorian society began to realize the scale of the problem, how addiction ceased to be a personal matter, and why the effects of painkillers haunted people even when the pain was no longer intolerable.
When the bill was given to everyone. At first, it was hard to count. Individual stories, individual families, individual tragedies that didn't add up to a big picture. But over time, the silence began to speak. Hospitals were filled with people who were no longer helped by conventional means. Workers were losing their jobs, not because of injuries, but because of exhaustion, tremors, and memory lapses. Mothers became withdrawn. Children became lethargic. Entire homes seemed to slow down. It no longer seemed like a private problem. Newspapers began to write cautiously. No harsh headlines, no direct accusations. Sedative abuse, moral weakness, oversensitivity. It was easier for society to blame people than to admit that it had been encouraging dangerous decisions for decades. Because if the problem was character, then the system didn't need to be changed. But the facts were piling up. Doctors began to see patients who couldn't get through treatment without opiates, even when their pain was already under control. Pharmacists noticed the same faces, the same hands shaking over the counter, the same requests, quiet, insistent, sometimes aggressive. This was a new phenomenon, and it was frightening, because addiction had no social status. It affected everyone. The poor more quickly because they had no alternatives. The wealthy more quietly because they could hide it. And over time, hiding it became harder. A society that had once prided itself on self-control and restraint suddenly saw its reflection in a bottle of dark liquid. And this reflection was unpleasant. Talks began about restrictions, control, the need for change. But every such conversation was met with fear. What would happen if the drugs were taken away? What would happen to those who could no longer do without them? Because giving up opiates meant bringing back the pain, bringing back the anxiety, bringing back what people had been running away from for years. And society hesitated. Between sympathy and condemnation, between the desire to help and the fear of opening another wound. Because now the question was different. Not, do these drugs work, but what price have we paid for them? And the answer to it turned out to be too complex for simple solutions. In the next chapter, we will see how the state first tried to intervene, why regulation was resisted, and what happened when the usual relief was taken away by force. When the fight against drugs began. The state never comes quietly. It appears when the problem can no longer be contained in hospitals, when it is visible on the streets, when it can no longer be called a private matter. In Victorian England, this moment came too late. Too many people could no longer do without drops. Too many homes lived to the rhythm of the bottle. Too many deaths were written off as exhaustion. And then a word was heard that scared more than pain. Control. They began to talk about restrictions on sales, about prescriptions, about the responsibility of pharmacists. To many, this sounded like a threat. Because if you take away access to laudanum, what will be left? Pain, anxiety, sleepless nights that nothing else could drown out. Pharmacists were the first to feel the strain. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They were selling what had been considered medicine for years, and now they were being told that this medicine was a problem. Some supported the change, quietly, without advertising. Others resisted, because control meant loss of revenue, loss of customer trust,
loss of a simple solution that everyone knew. Patients were afraid too. To them, regulation didn't look like protection, but like punishment. They weren't asked whether they wanted to give up. They were simply told, "You can't do it now." And that created a new kind of danger. People started looking for workarounds, buying more in advance, turning to illegal sellers, mixing different drugs to get the same effect. Control did not eliminate addiction. It only changed its form. Now it became darker, more hidden, and even more dangerous. Doctors found themselves between the law and their patients, between the rules and human suffering. To refuse meant leaving the person alone with the pain. To agree meant breaking the new norms. And not everyone could withstand this pressure. During this period, another crack appeared: trust. Patients were no longer sure that the doctor was acting in their best interests. Doctors were no longer sure that the system was protecting them. And once again, between the law and the body, there remained a person. Addicted, exhausted, scared. Because now the pain returned not as a physical sensation, but as a lack of choice. In the next chapter, we'll see what happened to those who couldn't adapt to the new rules, what quitting opiates looked like in a world without support, and why for many, the struggle with pain ended up as just another form of survival. When the relief is gone. The most dangerous moment is not the first dose or the first prohibition. The most dangerous moment is the sudden absence. When a bottle that has been at hand for years suddenly disappears. When the drops without which the day began are no longer available. For many Victorians, it was like falling into cold water. The body reacted first. The shivering, the sweating, the nausea, the insomnia that lasted at night. And with the body, the pain returned, stronger than before, more acute, as if the body was demanding payment for years of numbing. No one prepared people for this. There were no assistance programs. There were no explanations. There was no support. Opiate withdrawal didn't look like a cure, but like a punishment. People lost their jobs. They lost their ability to concentrate. They lost control of their own bodies. And society looked at them with incomprehension. Because on the outside, it looked like weakness, like a lack of will, like a personal failure. But inside, there was a struggle that few could endure. Some turned to illegal drugs. Some mixed alcohol with anything available. Some simply disappeared from sight. Deaths during this period were rarely associated with drug withdrawal. They were again called natural, sudden, incomprehensible. And only a few doctors began to understand that the problem had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. Because taking away the drug did not mean taking away the addiction. And removing pain from life is not the same as teaching a person to live without it. This was the moment when Victorian society first faced the full consequences of its own decisions. No excuses, no easy answers, and many couldn't stand it. Lessons learned too late. History rarely draws conclusions right away. It accumulates mistakes. It allows them to repeat themselves, and only when the consequences become obvious does it begin to change direction. Victorian medicine came to this slowly. Too many people had already gone from pain to the bottle to addiction, and from addiction to the loss of themselves. Doctors began to speak differently, more carefully, more precisely. A new understanding appeared in scientific texts. Pain is not just a symptom. and it cannot be treated by destroying the person next to it. Opiates were no longer considered neutral. Alcohol was no longer a universal solution. Awareness of dosage, risks, consequences appeared. But for many, this knowledge came too late. Those who had lived with laudanum for years could not simply move on. Their bodies remembered another state. Their psyches were shaped by dullness. They became shadows between eras, too sick for the old world, too broken for the new. And medicine was confronted for the first time with the fact that not everything could be fixed with treatment. A new question arose. Is the system responsible for those it created? The answer was inconvenient, because to admit this was to admit that progress has victims, and that these victims are not accidental, but the result of decisions made with good intentions. It is during this period that pain finally ceases to be normal, but the memory of it remains, in the methods, in the fears of doctors, in the distrust of patients. The history of opiates in Victorian England did not end with prohibition. It ended with awareness, a belated one, incomplete, but necessary.
Could you survive that? Imagine if choice disappeared, not because someone took it away, but because there never was another. Victorian man did not live in a world of possibilities. He lived in a world of compromises. Pain or oblivion, screaming or silence, consciousness or darkness. When the body broke, no one asked how you felt. They only asked if you could hold out a little longer. Pain was not a tragedy. It was the backdrop to life, as familiar as cold rooms, hard work, and early deaths. And when the bottles of dark liquid appeared, they seemed like mercy, not like danger, not like a trap, but like the only form of relief available at the time. People didn't drink because they wanted to forget. They drank to get through the day, to get through the morning, to take one more step. Some didn't wake up. Some woke up differently, but most just kept going, slowly, hard, dull. And if you look at it from a distance, it's easy to say, they didn't know, they were wrong, it was dangerous. But knowledge comes later, always. Then there was only a moment, a chair, a table, a bottle, and a person who decided whether to endure or drink. The story of Victorian painkillers is not about drugs. It's about the limits of human endurance, about how far people are willing to go when pain becomes the norm, and what they are willing to give to stop feeling it for a moment. Today, we live in a different world, with different knowledge, with different possibilities. But the question remains the same. If you had been born then, in a body that hurt, in a world without safe anesthesia, with the choice between screaming and darkness, would you have survived it?